Redeemer Queens Park exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. Redeemer is a spiritual family, a group of people from different backgrounds, different cultures, and different walks of life who have come together in the person of Jesus Christ. We share a common salvation and a common mission. We just completed a collection of talks on Redeemer's vision and values where we talked about the kind of church community that Redeemer aspires to be. In just 2 weeks' time, we'll be into the Advent season, and we'll be anticipating Christmas with a new collection of talks that will take us right up through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. We have so many special things planned for our community in the month ahead. But here we are in an in-between. In between a collection on Redeemer's vision and values and where we want to go for a collection on Advent, we want to press in to a few issues of what it means for us to be a community that actually lives like a community. We are a spiritual family. And of many things that we have in being a spiritual family, we are actually members of one another. That's part of what it means for us to be in Jesus. In Romans chapter 12, verse 5, the Apostle Paul says that in Christ we are members of one another. And that's our theme for this week and next week. We are members of one another. What a beautiful privilege that we get to enjoy. Today and 1 week from now, we do want to press into that metaphor to consider what does it look like practically then for us to live as members of one another. Allow me to read for you Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. The Apostle Paul writes, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. They can take pride in themselves alone, without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load." In this passage of Scripture, the Apostle Paul is talking to us about relationships in the church, in this spiritual family. And we see just a few things across these verses. The first thing we see is someone who's caught in sin. The second thing we see is someone who is suffering under the weight of a burden. And the next thing we see is what it looks like for us to be the kinds of people that know how to go to one another and to provide help and healing. And how can we be right with God as even that happens? I gotta be honest with you. I find this list of things incredibly encouraging. The Apostle Paul assumes that Christians are going to fall into sin. He assumes Christians are going to feel crushed under the weight of burdens. He assumes Christians are going to need to look in the mirror and think about how it's really going when we go to one another and we approach one another to talk about difficult things. I'm really helped by this. I hope that you'll be helped by it as well. The Apostle Paul doesn't approach us saying, "Oh, well, now you've trusted in Jesus and everything's completely sorted for you." He says there's still going to be some stuff to work out. We are all going to fall into different things. We are all going to have times of being trapped under different burdens. We are all going to need to be continually working on the kinds of people that we are as we represent Jesus in His world. So we're talking about relationships. And as we think about the Gospel's teaching on relationships, it's helpful for us to think how different this is than every other worldview, philosophy, or religion. Because if you're a part of a cult, well, the cult would simply say, here's this one idea. Believe this one thing and everything will be sorted for you. But not so with God. Christianity says faith in Jesus and you'll be able to endure the many sufferings and hardships that are coming your way. Christianity does not say believe in God and then everything's going to be sorted and you're going to be able to live a good life with no problems. Christianity says the gospel will give you a glory that will overwhelm the sufferings that you face, but not always remove it. There are probably 3 to 4 different sermons in just these few verses, Galatians 6, 1 through 5. But we're just going to focus on one today. What does it look like for us to be a people that realizes ourselves as belonging to one another, that we're members of one another? And specifically, what does it look like for us to be a people that know how to get involved with each other and to carry each other's burdens? Carrying burdens, that's the theme I want to speak with you on. But let me give you just one idea that could be really helpful to have in mind before we go there. This idea of carrying burdens, it requires that we first understand ourselves as people made for fellowship. We are individuals in need of community. We're in need of others, and we are in need of fellowship. To be human is to be someone who relates to God and relates to other people. Our personal responsibility before God does not exclude us from our personal accountability to one another. Galatians, as a book, what the whole thing is about, it's a call to abandon the natural modern impulse of letting other people do whatever they would like. Galatians is a book that calls us, warrants us, and sends us into one another's lives with help, with truth, with clarity, for healing. So Galatians forces us to go to one another and to be open with one another. To be a neighbor means that we are both neighborly and we receive neighborly care from one another. So let's get into it. The standard of the gospel, the call to carry one another's burdens, and the power to be able to do it. Redeemer, before we talk about the practical inner workings of how we ought to relate to one another as a community, we first need to be refreshed with the truth of the gospel again. Let's think about the relationship between the gospel and our relationships. The gospel is the good news about what God has already accomplished for us by sending Jesus Christ to the cross to die a painful death for your sin and my sin. The gospel has made all the difference. The gospel is not the ABCs of the Christian faith, it's the A to Zs of the Christian faith. The gospel is not the diving board that we just jump into this pool of Christianity. The gospel is the pool that we swim around in. The gospel is not the first few stairs in a staircase of truth. The gospel is the whole staircase. And the gospel is not just one more truth within the Christian life, and there's other ideas that now we are about to move on to. The gospel is the hub of which all the other truths of the Christian life connect to. So when we talk about relationships and when we press into some of the practicalities of what it means for us to be a community that lives together in love, we are not moving on from the gospel to do this. It's not like we've talked about the gospel and now we are talking about something else. Even talking about how we love one another as a community, how we go to one another as a community. This is a mere process of talking about what does it look like for us to be a people that goes deeper into the gospel. Because Galatians 6 verses 1 through 5, these bits about how we ought to live together in community, this is coming after many, many, many encouragements in the letters so far about who God is and what He's already done for us. So let's just give a quick think on how Paul is writing here. When you think about it, we're getting into some very practical things after a lot of facts have already been given. And this is important because just a key to being able to read the Bible and understand what it means is that indicatives always are the grounding for the imperatives, or imperatives always flow from indicatives. So we got to think on this one for just a minute. Indicatives, statements about God, what He has done for you, the gospel. Imperatives are statements about how you and I should live in response to God. Now, don't miss it, Redeemer. The imperatives, the things that we are called to do, they find their grounding in the indicatives, in this news about what God has already done. Before you and I can be a people that takes on the imperatives, that takes on the commands of Scripture, we have to first be a people that's rooted and grounded in the indicatives of Scripture, that find our base in God. Otherwise, we end up with legalism. Otherwise, we will end up with religion. Legalism is when Christianity is mutated into a list of moral do's and don'ts, and that is not what we are about today. The gospel says that you and I are more sinful than we could ever dare to believe, and we are more loved in Jesus Christ than we could ever hope. So we have so much to be grateful for, Redeemer. And as we press into a few practicalities here, we don't move on from the gospel. This is all an exercise in going deeper in what it means for us to be a people shaped by the gospel. Because the gospel transforms our relationships in three different ways. The gospel humbles you and it humbles me. The gospel humbles us together. The gospel teaches that there's nothing that we could really do to make us better than someone else. Everything that we have is a gift of grace, and the gospel humbles us. But the gospel completes us as well. The gospel says you don't need glory or distinction from others because you already have the approval of God in Jesus Christ. Redeemer, the gospel completes us. We lack nothing. And finally, Redeemer, the gospel redirects us. The gospel redirects us rather than being a person focused on using others to meet your needs. I don't have to be a person that focuses on other people to meet my needs. No, we can become the type of people that use ourselves to meet the needs of other people. The gospel redirects us. The focus and attention doesn't have to be about you and me anymore. It can be about one another and a world in great need. And the gospel comes into our lives and it provides the balance we need in relationships. Jesus Christ was full of truth and he was full of love. The ideal is that we be people that know how to be truthful with one another and we know how to be loving with one another. We know how to be diplomatic and take our time getting to issues, and we know how to be lovingly direct. We know how to be tough and we know how to be tender. And the gospel comes into us and it offers to activate what is lacking and broken in us. Because without Jesus, we usually trend one way or another, don't we? I mean, come on. It's so easy for some of us just to plod along with each other, always loving each other and never calling out truth. It's so easy for others of us to be incredibly truthful with each other and lack tenderness, compassion, and love. And what the gospel does, the gospel comes to us and it completes us. It looks at the other part that we don't have and it gives it to us in grace, and it makes us whole. Naturally, we're either one or the other, but the gospel comes to us and it activates everything we need to grow up into the fullness of Jesus. So let's think practically about what this looks like in our relationships with one another. Okay, Redeemer, we've talked about what the gospel is. Now let's press into it by practically considering what it looks like for us to live in relationship with one another. Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently, but watch yourselves because you might also be tempted. Let's think about it together, Redeemer. Sin is not like a bullet or a thorn, something that's far into us that's coming into us. Sin can oftentimes be like a dislocated joint within us. It's something good, it's something that's a part of us, and it's just something that's out of whack. Redeemer, Galatians leads us to be a people that when we see things in each other that are dislocated, or if we even see foreign things that have found their way in, we become the kind of people that go to one another in love to gently restore one another. Did you notice some of the bits of the text right here that restores that person gently? We're not going to one another to wound one another. The worst thing we could do is to go to someone in sin and lay that person low. No, we go to one another gently. You actually notice the attention of the text is, yeah, it's on that person with that issue, of course, but it's on you and me as the people that go to one another to provide that help and that healing. See, our great problem, oftentimes, it isn't sex, or it isn't career, it isn't friendship. Those things are perfectly fine. But sometimes we'll look around into each other's lives and we'll see perfectly good things that are just out of place. Good things that have become great things, what the Bible calls an idol. We got to go to one another. We got to have conversations with one another because we are members of one another. Everything about it, the tone, the setting, the demeanor, it's all designed to provide healing. And we'll never do a good job of going to one another to provide healing and care if we go to one another thinking we've got it figured out. It's the worst way it could go. So verse 1, we see someone in sin. Galatians 6:1 authorizes us. We are a community who can go to one another to gently restore and provide healing. But look at verse 2. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Well, this means a few things. When we're looking around the Redeemer community, maybe you see someone that's not struggling under the weight of a sin. They're actually just struggling under the weight of a burden. Now, that's good for us to know. There's going to be times when we struggle, and sometimes our struggle is not the result and consequence of sin. Sometimes we're just having a hard time. Sometimes we just need people to come to us in love and to get in it with us. A few things we can learn about how to become a people that carry each other's burdens well. The first thing we see here is that we need to be a people that listen until the burden is first understood. To help someone carry a burden, we must first understand that burden. We have to sit down with one another. We have to listen until it's understood. You know the times when someone has just sat down with you and listened to you talk, and you were just so bogged down at the beginning, and at the end of the conversation, you almost feel free? Think about what's happened in that moment. Your situation oftentimes has not changed. The problem is still the problem. But oh, the relief that comes when you have simply been heard and understood. Redeemer, we can provide this for one another. The next thing we do is that we get under that burden with someone and we carry it. This means that we actually have to suffer some with the person who's carrying that burden as well. One of the ways we carry and bear the burdens of other people is we actually take on some of their pain and some of their suffering in our own life. This is a big theme, and it's not just here in Galatians 6:2. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians 12:26. If one member suffers, we all suffer together. And if one member is honored, we all rejoice together, because we are members of one another. Well, he goes on in verses 3, 4, and 5. He's going to talk to us about the kind of people that we must be in order to be the kinds of people that can go to one another and gently confront when we see a sin, or to submit ourselves to the needs of one another and to get under burdens with each other. And frankly, there is so much here, and I really don't have time in this one talk. I told you there's about 3 to 4 sermons just here. But let me just point out a few briefly. Galatians 6:3, if anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. If we are going to be the kind of people that can go to one another and bear one another's burdens, we have to have a proper gospel view of our lives first. That's the big idea right here. Then in verse 4, each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. Each one should carry their own load. Just a few bits need to be spoken to here, Redeemer. Again, going deeper into the gospel. When Paul talks about this load that all of us must carry here, it's a different word than burden in the Greek. The burden refers to this suffering or this pain or this struggle that one person might be under. And while that person is under a burden, that person, you and me and the rest of us, we all have our own load to carry. We all have our own load of responsibilities, gifts, and burdens that the Lord grants to us. We all have our own load that we are responsible for. The load actually refers to a soldier's backpack. Yeah, the soldier in combat. He has a job to work out, but he's got to carry his own load. And a soldier in combat, when a soldier sees one of his own go down, well, the soldier's going to go, and the soldier is going to submit his or her needs to the love and care of another, but he's got to carry his own load. So sometimes we actually take on extra load. We take on the burdens of other people while carrying our own loads ourselves. Now this is very helpful because it means when we engage with one another in care, we can't stop caring for ourselves. We have to be a people that's taking care of ourselves as we go to one another, to gently talk to one another about sin and to help carry
each other's burdens. Let me try to wrap this up. In summary here, we are therefore not to compare ourselves with other people, but we are to compare ourselves with the load and responsibilities that God has uniquely assigned to each and every one of us. Think about it, Redeemer. Otherwise, we are going to become an incredibly competitive bunch that is honestly an incredible bore to be around. When we look around, if we were to set the standard at any other one person, or any other family, or any other marriage, or any other person in the community, we ought to look to that person and say, that's the ideal, I have to live according to it. Conceited arrogance is going to take over. We would become a type of people that when we are doing better than whatever's been established as the ideal, we'll be inflated with pride. Oh, look at us, we're doing so much better than that person. Or, whenever we see ourselves failing to live up to the standard of another mere human being, oh, conceited arrogance comes on as well there when we find ourselves growing envious of the grace that God has put into someone else's life. It also helps us be the type of people, Redeemer, that when we see someone in the community going on, and it might look like they are just struggling and stumbling on in this race of faith, we might see someone that's just murmuring along, and we might think, man, things look awfully hard with them. But if the judgment that we bring to one another is just counting ourselves according to our own load that God has assigned to us, we might actually see someone, a brother or sister, that looks ill-tempered one day or one week or in one season, but it could actually be that he or she is actually doing better in the race of faith because that person's being responsible to the load and the assignments that God has on them. So we don't have to look around and measure other people against our own selves. Redeemer, you don't have to measure yourself against me. That would be an absurd thing for us to try to do. And not against Daniel, not against anyone else that might lead out in this community. You look to Jesus, measure yourself against him, and hold yourself accountable to the load that he has assigned to you. Well, let me start to wrap things up with a quote from Pastor John Stott. Yes, while we want to be a people that humbly and confidently go to one another to help one another with other people's tasks and other people's problems and other people's burdens, there is one burden that we should never try to carry on our own. And John Stott says this, there is one burden that we cannot share, and that is our responsibility to God on the day of judgment. On that day, you cannot carry my pack, and I cannot carry yours. Redeemer, while God is calling us into one another's lives to help call out sin when we can see it, while God is calling us into one another's lives to help carry the burdens of one another, we are all responsible for doing our part and carrying our load. Now let's talk about the power and the resource for how to do it well. Redeemers, we see this coming together right here. We're thinking about how to carry one another's burdens. This does not mean that other people's burdens should crush you or to crush me. But how do we get this right? Right? How is it that we can grow and become the kind of people that we aren't going to other people and being crushed by the weight of their burdens, and yet we're not avoiding other people and not experiencing any weight from their burden at all? Well, it all comes back to Jesus. Consider, Redeemer, Psalm 34, verse 18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. Redeemer, the reason why you and me can be a people that go to one another and help carry the burdens of each other, it's because Jesus Christ has already carried our burdens up the hill of Calvary, and he was already crushed under the weight of our sin. That's all the resource we ever need to think about what it looks like for you and me to look at one another and to come alongside of one another and to carry each other up. How about Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 6? Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each one of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. There is one burden that we should never try to carry, and that is the burden of our own salvation before a holy God. So let me try to apply this and work this out across the Redeemer community in a few different ways. First, for all of us, Jesus has already carried the weight of your sin. He was already crushed for what is crushing you. Redeemer, look to Jesus. Trust in Jesus. Receive the easy yoke that Jesus offers to you. And Redeemer, we are free. That's the massive idea of the book of Galatians. We are free. We are free to go to Christ. We are free to not have to try to keep rules in order to justify ourselves before God. We are free to give our burdens to Jesus and to open up our lives with one another. And Redeemer, we are free to go to one another and to provide healing and help and care. We're free. Now, let's think about how this applies to a few of us across the community. The way this really applies to me is sometimes I find myself being crushed underneath the burdens of other people. And it's because I, in that moment, have taken my eyes off of Jesus. Oh, I am so prone to go to other people and to try to carry their burdens, but I find myself being crushed by them because in those moments, I'm trying to actually carry their salvation. And in other moments, I'm actually trying to justify myself before God and others by taking on a responsibility I was never meant to carry. Redeemer, the only person that can heal is a wounded healer. Let's be in touch with the fact that we can't save ourselves and we can't save one another. And as we are, we can become the kind of people that can lovingly go to one another and shoulder each other up and provide genuine help. Redeemer, we don't have to avoid the burdens of one another as well. Someone might hear this and just know, man, I am being crushed by the weight of my burden. Well, you can take it to Jesus and you can go open it up with a brother or sister as well. And Redeemer, we are free. We are free to help carry the burdens of one another. And when you need any inspiration or idea for what this looks like, think about how Jesus has already been good to you. Consider the way that Jesus has come to you. Consider the ways that Jesus has already lived your burden from your perspective. Consider the ways that Jesus has submitted his life, his preferences, his time, and his energy to your burden. He got all the way under it. Jesus is the only one that could actually take it from you, and he's buried it at the cross. Redeemer, think about the ways that God has been good to you, and let that be all the inspiration you need to go to your brothers and sisters and be good to one another. So all of us together, looking to Jesus in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Redeemer, we are indeed members of one another. Let's look to Jesus to live it well.
I was caught in the longest dream, and I was born for a time like this. You plant the seed and you watch it grow, and we'll be free, we'll be free. Well, I fought hard, I kicked against the goad. The storm blew fast, the storm took what I loved. The sign I saw, it was a sign above. And we are free, we are free.